The FDA has undergone some major changes recently, including the layoffs of thousands of employees and budget cuts. And as you've heard from our recent segment with FDA researcher Daniel Aaron, the agency had already been struggling to fulfill all of its responsibilities before these most recent challenges. In fact, the organization has a long history of searching for patchwork solutions that don't use extra resources. One popular move is called the GRAS list, which stands for Generally Recognized as Safe. It's a collection of substances that don't need a formal pre-market review because qualified experts have agreed they're safe within the context of their intended use. While it helps reduce some burden from the FDA, Jennifer Pomeranz says it's created a loophole where food companies can self-determine that an additive is considered GRAS without ever notifying the FDA.
The food industry is required to submit a petition for the FDA to review food additives and color additives. However, they can just opt to put in ingredients that they've determined are generally recognized as safe or GRAS. There is no requirement that the industry even run that by the FDA and say, should this be a food additive or should this be GRAS? The industry can just determine for itself that, we've decided this is a GRAS ingredient. They're supposed to engage in scientific research to confirm that it's generally recognized as safe. But there's no requirement that they actually show this data to the FDA or even tell the FDA that they're adding these ingredients to food.
Pomeranz is a public health lawyer and associate professor at the NYU School of Global Public Health. She notes that the GRAS loophole has had a giant footprint in our country. A 2022 analysis by the Environmental Working Group estimates that nearly 99% of new food chemicals have used this policy workaround since the year 2000.
So that's concerning because there is no oversight or even knowledge of some of the ingredients in our food supply. And remember, if they want to submit the food additives petition, then that's kind of their decision whether they're going through that food additives framework or GRAS framework. There is no regulation telling them which one they have to choose. So a lot of these decisions are being left to industry.
There is a post-market review process that's designed to catch any harmful products that may have slipped through the cracks. However, Pomeranz says that the agency doesn't actually have the resources needed to make this system effective.
Even though they have the full authority, they don't have the resources to engage in that post-market review. And what we see as a result is that ingredients with known evidence of harm, decades of evidence of harm, remain in our food supply where the FDA is not removing it. There are many examples. Industrial trans fat, which was removed very recently, there were 30 years of evidence that it was harmful. BVO, which is brominated vegetable oil, was in the food supply for 53 years, and there was evidence of harm back then.
BVO is a food additive that's been used in drinks since the 1920s to prevent the flavor oils from separating. It was added to the original GRAS list, but was removed in the late 60s due to toxicity concerns. The FDA states that there wasn't enough data to fully remove the additive from the market, so the agency limited its use level in products. Still, it took more than 40 years after this decision to gather enough data for the FDA to finally revoke the use of BVO in 2024. Companies now have 1 year to reformulate, relabel, and sell the rest of their products that contain BVO before the rule is enforced.
The post-market authority and review is slow, sporadic, it's not comprehensive, and it's definitely not rigorous, and it's not responding to the science. Also, what it's not responding to is when Europe is removing ingredients from their food supply, there should be some type of effort immediately on the US to say the default should be maybe we should look at this ingredient as well, but we haven't been doing that.
Again, the slow action isn't a purposeful move to keep dangerous ingredients in our food. It's a harmful side effect of minimal resources and funding. Experts like Pomeranz believe that many of these failings can be improved if the food industry started paying a sort of tax to the FDA called user fees. The tobacco and pharmaceutical industries both pay user fees. In fact, these dues account for nearly half of the FDA's current budget.
There are user fees for every type of human drug. There are user fees for animal drugs, and there's user fees for tobacco. The drug budgets, they're reauthorized every 5 years, which allows Congress to reevaluate and also, see how they're working out. The way every single user fee is authorized is actually through Congress. So the agency can't do that unilaterally. but Congress will implement the user fee programs. But in general, the way the numbers are determined is actually through negotiations between the FDA and the industry trade groups.
It's a system that helps both parties. The FDA receives enough resources to effectively do its job, and the drug manufacturers get their products reviewed in an appropriate amount of time. However, a question that's often asked is how much room does this negotiation leave for corruption to take place?
It is a very common concern. The interesting thing is we did not see any indication that user fees ended up corrupting the FDA's ultimate judgment. User fees are only to pay for the process. So they basically pay for registration of companies, the process of reviewing applications. There's no guarantee on the outcome.
However, Pomeranz says that in general, there are instances of regulatory capture. This refers to a situation where the agency is accidentally influenced by the industries it's policing. As a result, the agency begins to act in ways that benefit the interests of the industries. While this does happen, Pomeranz says that it's not directly connected to the user fee system.
We see that as a problem across industries. For example, the food industry essentially polices itself, and there are really almost no user fees in the food context. So that industry capture of regulatory interests, that is happening like separate from user fees.
There are a couple of food-specific user fees currently in place, but Pomeranz says they only make up about 1% of the entire foods program budget, which in 2022 was just over $1 billion.
It's for color additives have a user fee. There are also user fees from the Food Safety Modernization Act, and these are things for recall or reinspection. The FDA actually doesn't collect those user fees, even though they're authorized to do so. The reason is they said that they wouldn't collect them until they issued a small business guidance, which actually helped small businesses either reduce their fees or be able to abide by the fees in an easier way. The FDA hasn't issued that small business guidance, so it doesn't collect the user fees that it's allowed to collect. Then there's a voluntary user fee program for different, very small parts of the FDA's oversight as well. So that's where that 1% is coming in from these voluntary programs and then the color additives. But really, that 1% is a minor drop, and it's not really funding the major operations of the FDA when it comes to food.
Pomeranz says the user fees are needed to fund more than the review of additives. There are countless processes that require oversight but aren't getting done in a timely manner, if at all. For example, if a new infant formula is introduced that has major changes to existing products, the FDA is notified and has 90 days to review that petition. At least that's what's supposed to happen. Pomeranz says they currently don't have the resources to meet that expectation.
They can't review it within 90 days. They don't have the resources to do it. So that also slows down the infant formula companies. And as I mentioned earlier, there's health claims that the companies want to put on their products, but because it takes a really long time for the FDA to review those, they don't get to put them on their products for years. So there are other areas where user fees will speed up these processes, and that is actually helping industry get to market quicker.
However, Pomeranz says this timeliness isn't a big enough incentive to bring the industry to the bargaining table, especially when they can already use the GRAS loophole to bring many other products directly to market.
Well, it's the GRAS loophole for safety reasons. And then user fees are a really natural result of closing that GRAS loophole, because then the industry will want to make sure that they can get to market quick. And in order to do that quickly, the FDA will need user fees to fund those operations.
Pomeranz has a few ideas on how to close the loophole, one being that the FDA has to review the data establishing an additive as safe.
Which is not actually the worst idea, because we have so many ingredients already in the food supply. Anything new created is clearly not like something from nature. It would be an industrially created ingredient at this point, right? There are less rigorous ways they could just notify the FDA of their determination that something is GRAS and also provide the science to the FDA. At least it would give the FDA the information that the FDA could review, but then they would still go to market after a certain period of days.
At the very least, the manufacturers could add the ingredients to a public database.
This would allow nonprofit organizations to review the evidence of safety, and also it would really keep the industry from putting in ingredients in the food supply where the evidence of safety does not support that it's safe, right? So if this is public data, they're not going to put in something that clearly the evidence doesn't support the safety. So that's not a bad idea. And it's also much less labor intensive, right, to put it on a public database.
Unfortunately, the FDA is in a tough spot at the moment. In order to bring the food industry to the bargaining table, they need to close the GRAS loophole. However, they need the resources to be able to do that, which would come from the user fees. Pomeranz says that instead of using regulation to force the industry's hand, Congress needs to step in to create change.
It's time for Congress to come in and close the GRAS loophole and then simultaneously require user fees. Or, frankly, Congress can increase appropriations to the FDA. It would have a similar impact of giving them resources. The problem is that every year the FDA will have to implore Congress to keep that appropriations up. So user fees are a little bit more of a stable funding stream. There are like dozens of user fees that the FDA gets, and they can model it after most of them. I can imagine more, the petition review fees. It makes the most sense. You could have facility registration fees. There's a lot of fees they could put on. I mean, my goal here is to make our food supply safe and healthy ultimately, but safe here initially. So we don't need to nickel and dime the food industry. The fees should really just go to the FDA ensuring the safety of our food supply.
You can find more information about Jennifer Pomeranz and all of our guests on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. For more behind the scenes, follow Radio Health Journal on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Our writer-producer is Kristen Farah. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. I'm Elizabeth Westfield.